Hi. Apparently we're live. Coming to you again. My name's Joan Jack, and I'm coming to you again tonight from my sewing area. Those of you that watched last night know that this is a sacred space to me, and I find peace here, and I create for others here, and I create for myself here. Tonight I am going to see what I feel like saying about identity, place, and belonging. Once it came to me to talk about that, I got nervous because those are very controversial and loaded, very, very loaded words in Indian country. So let's see what let's see what happens. Well, I've been focusing on the Indian Act, so let's just start there. Under the Indian Act, many people don't realize that it's simply a system of registration. So at treaty time, for example, in the numbered treaties 1 to 11, I'm of course completely generalizing, which is always dangerous, but at treaty time, you know, the people that came with the treaty party set up registration, and we hear stories passed on about how, you know, our family was out on the trap line, so we completely missed treaty registration, so our family has no status. And then there's other things like because the common law is patriarchal, it follows the man. It used to anyway. There's supposed to be gender equity now in the common law in Canada, but within the Indian Act there still isn't. That's another whole thing. So at treaty time, for example, there were some non-Indigenous fur traders that were married to Indigenous women, and then when the treaty came and they said, you know, do you want to register as an Indian? Then that fur trader was smart enough to say, yeah, I do. And so some families, because it follows the man, never lost registration, never lost status. And then another thing that really needs to be cleared up is that registration on the Indian Act has nothing really to do with treaties, except they were, from Canada's point of view, they were trying to see and determine the extent of their liability. So they were trying to just do a numbers, find out how many, what this was going to cost them in terms of liability. So I've probably already said things that offend people because, you know, people talk about, you know, my treaty card. It's not a treaty card. It's a registered Indian status card. I should have brought mine. Anyways, it just, can somebody in the living room bring my purse up, please? It's by my chair. And so, when people say treaty gas, stuff like that, that's not treaty gas. That's happening because you're a registered Indian and there are tax provisions under the Indian Act that create a situation where you can benefit in a very small way. I mean, heck, I would rather have all the land back, thank you. Okay, here comes Brian. I just want to show my registered Indian card. Thanks, honey. Let's see, make sure I'm still an Indian. So, where's my card? Some people haven't seen them. Not anybody who's a registered Indian, but these are the old cards for people who haven't seen them. I'm just gonna put my thumb over my number so nobody tries and get status gas. And so we have to, we're registered the first, and so another thing people don't know, and I'm really digressing here, but it's about identity. The first three numbers of your registered Indian card are the number of your band, and you probably know this, but so my band is Barons River 266. My husband's band is 501. So all of those registered as Indian to Barons River First Nation, their cards start with 266. All of those registered to the Talk River Tlingit First Nation start with 501. So those first three numbers represent the band, and then the last numbers represent you. And up until about 10, maybe 15, I'm guessing, years ago, somebody can correct me, the man would have 1 at the end of the thing, and then his wife would have 2, and their children would have 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They would all have the same number because it followed the man. And that was changed a few years ago so that we all have our own number. So it's like a social insurance number. It's a form of registration, yeah, that puts us under Section 9124 and takes, I was saying in a couple of videos ago that, you know, they put us under Section 9124, Indians and lands reserved specifically, it doesn't say specifically, but Indians and lands reserved for Indians in Section 9124, which is 91 is the federal head of power, and then took the rest of our land, all of our children responsibilities. That's why the CFS is provincial, education is provincial, health is provincial, and then when we're involved, the federal government has to give the province money. So it's very complicated, and it's always about the money. So there's our card. So that's not what makes you who you are as an Indigenous person. But, you know, we've come to see it as that. I've seen many sovereignists over the years who are not registered as Indian and then become eligible because of case law, and then boom, all of a sudden they go and get registered. I didn't get registered. Like, I grew up on the Métis side in Barons River because it's another long whole thing about how women who married outside to somebody who wasn't registered would lose status, and that still happens generationally. So my family married my grandmother in Barons River. My great-grandmother in Barons River married a non-registered Indigenous man, a Métis man, and then lost her registration. And so it wasn't until after Bill C-31 that those of us that were descendant from her in Barons River were entitled to be registered with Barons River. And then through my mother on her mother's side, my mother's mother is registered to the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan. So I have a whole bunch of relatives in Saskatchewan at the Cowessess First Nation. So why am I sharing all this? Well, it's just a number, and it's a system to register who's Indian in this country. So Bill C-31 came into effect in 1985 and caused all kinds of trouble because, number one, it was underfunded. It wasn't funded properly, and it didn't take care of the gender issues. But there are other people like Sharon McIver. Find her; she can explain this to you like lots. She's fought like her whole life about it. It's a terrible thing. And so in 1985, look at Barons River, for example, where I'm from. Before 1985, all of the registered Indians were living on the North Shore, and all of the Métis people were living on the South Shore. And so there was a lot of intermarriage, of course, over the years. I mean, hey, people had boats and fell in love across the river, both directions. So if a woman if a registered Indian woman on this side fell in love with a Métis guy on this side and moved across the river, she lost her status. If a Métis woman fell in love on this side with a registered Indian, she gained status. And even white women who married registered Indians before 1985 gained status. And so that's what that's about. And that's how some people have come to see identity. So when Brian and I finished law school in 1991, and I still was not registered as an Indian, and I had 2 children from another man. And when I got here, I was pregnant with Shirley, and I already had Lonnie, and she was 2.5. And Brian has been such an amazing Indigenous father, you know, like just standing right in there. And this kind of goes to the third point I'm making tonight about belonging. You know, I think we belong where we're loved. That's where we belong. And when we feel loved, we feel belonging. So let's just park that thought. Maybe it'll come back. So then I realized, because I was a lawyer, that so Brian wanted to legally adopt my daughters. And then we had another son together. And so I realized, because I'm a lawyer, that if I didn't get registered myself, I realized this when I was pregnant with Henry, that if I didn't get registered myself, that my child, I didn't know I was going to have a son, would not be entitled to registration under the Indian Act because I was I wasn't registered. And Brian is a 6'1" because he has 2 parents that are registered, which would make our child a 6'2", which would mean that our child that I was pregnant with would not have any descent rights. So I realized all that, having been to law school, and so I agreed, you know, that, you know, Brian legally adopted my daughters, and he's raised them. They are his daughters, and that's one good thing I can say about the white law, in adoption, when somebody is adopted in the white law, it's as if they were birthed by those parents. So their records are sealed until they're 18, and you have to make application to find out who, blah, blah, blah. So the kids, so then as soon as Brian I got registered because I was entitled, and then our children are all 6'1" because I'm a 6'2", because as I shared last night, my father is non-Indigenous by blood. So my mother, who is a 6'1", married my father, who is nothing under the Indian Act. So that makes me a 6'2". So I have no descent rights on my own. But because I'm married to a 6'1", my husband, and he adopted my 2 children, and we have one birth child together, all 3 of our children are 6'1", because a 6'1" and a 6'2" make a 6'1". But 2 6'2" only make a 6'2". And those of you out there who've done membership under the Indian Act know there's like about 16 categories of numbered kind of Indians. It's just really terrible that that system is what many of our people have come to identify with as determining who they are as Indigenous people. And Brian and I really consciously raised our children without that understanding. We raised our children to know that they were Tlingit, because he's Tlingit, and Anishinaabe, because I identify as Anishinaabe. I also want to talk about mixed blood in a minute. This is a really complicated subject. There's so many layers to it. So I just want to tell a funny story. Okay, so one day Lonnie, who is now like 30 and so fair you wouldn't even think she was Indigenous, you know, so she's like an invisible Indigenous person who has to suffer the racism all the time because people around her, non-Indigenous people around her, think she's non-Indigenous and say all kinds of ugly things about Indigenous people. So she's always got a choice about whether or not she wants to do some educating, some deleting, or whatever. It's very tough being a non-visible, like a fair-skinned Indigenous person. Anyways, so the school called here in Atlin and said, Lonnie won't stop crying. Could you please come and get her? And she was like 5. And I think she was in kindergarten or grade 1, I'm not sure. Anyways, so I drove into the school as quickly as I could, and it's about a 10-kilometer drive from the reserve out here. And when I got there, I got her in the truck, and I just stayed calm, and, you know, and she was kind of going, you know, that thing kids do when they've been crying hard. And I was like, oh, honey, what happened? And she said, the teacher took us to this place where there was somebody, a man hanging, and he was bleeding, and he was nailed like on wood, like this, she said, and she was crying so hard, and I was like, oh my goodness. Because while I've since come back to Jesus, at that time in my life, I had moved away, and I had decided that I was going through this big decolonization phase, and we didn't even tell our kids anything about Jesus, you know? And so that was the first time she'd seen the cross, and I was like, oh my goodness, what am I going to say? So I said to her, well, honey, I said, you know, some people believe that God sent his son to look like us so that he could be here with us. And I said, and they think that that's what God looks like. And I didn't know what to tell a 5-year-old. And so I'm driving along, and she's like, oh, okay, well, why don't they take him down now? And so I don't know about that. So then we're driving, she's getting calmer. And then I said, what else happened today, honey? And she said, oh, and then we sang to the Queen. She said, who's the Queen? And apparently that poor teacher had had a nervous breakdown and taken a class on an unauthorized school trip to the church where she made them all sing God Save the Queen. And I was like, oh my goodness, Jesus and the Queen in the same day. And so I said, well, and I said to her, you know, the Queen is this old lady that lives way across the water on an island. And she thinks she owns our land. And then Lonnie, who's been indoctrinated by sovereign worldview at 5, says, like the idea that our land could be owned by a little old white lady across an ocean that lived on an island was preposterous to a child. So I'm just really sharing that to make the point that we are, you know, that poem, like we are what we live and all that. So many of us went to residential school, day schools, where we were beaten for being who we are. And I'm using the royal we. Like, I did go to day school, but like maybe for 2 years or something. Like but that cultural self-hate is still alive and well today in us. Many people are still ashamed of being who they are as Indigenous people. And that's the healing that we are doing generation after generation. Like, I'm really looking forward to seeing what my grandchildren are like, and how they see the world and move in the world, because it won't occur to them to ask anyone's permission to do anything. And that's how most human beings operate. They just do what they want. So I don't want to get too far off. So I want to talk a little bit about blood quantum. Well, I guess I'll start by saying Hitler was a purist. The whole thing that happened over there, as much as I could understand, was about some blood being better than other blood, And when we act like that, I'll tell another story. I was doing a constitution with an elder, I won't say which community, and he was talking to me about the constitution. He said, well, we have to have like a quarter blood cut off. That's it. We don't want too many people. And I was like, interesting. So I knew his family tree. So I said to him, oh, okay. What are you going to do with, let's call her Jane. I said, what are you going to do with Jane? Because I knew in the quantum, she was probably maybe 1/16th, 1/8 if we're lucky, kind of thing, if from that point of view. And he got it right away. He was like, huh? Because that little baby, that great-grandchild, was being raised by those old people. So she learned how to make dry fish. She learned how to make dry meat. She learned how to hunt. She learned how to trap. She learned how all kinds of stuff she was learning. And by this point, she was already a young woman. And so he got it, and he was like, okay, 1 drop of blood, good enough for me, he said. But this whole division that comes from the Indian Act and the theft of our land has created this idea that some people are better Indians than others because they have more blood than others. I'm full blood. I'm a full blood. Like, whatever. Get over yourself. It doesn't make you any better. What makes you better is how you walk in the world and contribute. That's Indigenous. Like I said last night, dependence means you're responsible for yourself. And so a common question I get is, well, you're mixed blood. One time I was on a plane. Thank God I was on a plane. And I was sitting beside this guy who was a vice president from Canada Post, because we're chatting up, whatever. And then we got to the point about blood quantum, and he said, well, what is your heritage? He said, you don't really look Indigenous to me. And I said to him, oh, my mom and blah, blah. And I said, my dad's, Lebanese, but he was born in Canada and whatever. And he goes, that's why you're so smart. When I told him that I had Middle Eastern blood. And we were on a plane, or I probably would have thrown him somewhere. And then I just stopped talking, and I had to fly the rest of the flight beside him. People don't realize how racist they are when they say to us, well, what's your blood quantum? And so I've learned to be gentle about it and to say, maybe we should talk about why you're asking that. Because sometimes people are asking it for a genuinely, just a curious, nothing to do with racism way. But most of the time when people are asking you what your blood quantum is, it's because they are trying to, it's not good. Anyway, whatever. I'm sure I could get 1,000 comments from 1,000 Indigenous persons in this feed that have all had that experience. And then, so my point is on the blood quantum thing, when we do that to ourselves, it's the most horrible thing. It's the most horrible, culturally, self-hating, racist thing we can do to ourselves. And that's also, if I'm going to be a cynic or a conspiracy theorist, that's also someone's plan sitting in Ottawa. I'll tell one more story. I was at a meeting, and this my what do they call them, marine biologist, I was said to him, hey, what about the such and such indigenous people that are in that land? You're talking about that land as if it's empty, you know? We're here now and we can read and write, you know? You can't do this whole terra nullius thing you were doing before about the land is empty. And he was like, oh, okay, all right. He said, what's the number in the tribe? Because he was from the States, I said, oh, I don't know, maybe 800. He said, you know, moot point. He said, 500 years from now, you're all going to be gone. All right, let's keep talking about the whales and whatever, you know. It was like, whoa, you know. For me, that was another big wake-up call. Those of us that are of Cree and Anishinaabe ancestry and probably Navajo, like some of the bigger nations, they will probably, like some of the smaller nations, I don't know. So that's why the way of life and the values associated with that way of life are what's critical to identity. And then place. I want to talk a little bit about place. This is a long one, sorry. Place. When you're flying over northern Manitoba, I was flying with this guy one time and he's like, wow, I can't believe, you know, we flew over Blood Vein, and we're on our way to Barons, and he's like, just like in the middle, you know, we're in the boreal forest. The east side of Lake Winnipeg used to be one of the largest unroaded boreal forests on the planet. It isn't anymore because we have a road, but anyways, we're flying along and he was like, wow, just like in the middle of nowhere, all of a sudden, boop, there's like some people. And then, you know, same with our community, And I laughed and he said, I wonder how long they've been there. And I said, I don't know. How long have German people been in Germany? How long have French people been in France? Japanese people been in Japan? I don't know. Long time, I think. And he's like, I wonder why they're there, right there. And I said, I have no idea. But it is globally specific place. We, like other nations around the world, define ourselves in terms of globally specific place. Just like the Japanese come from Japan, the Germans come from Germany, and so on. Indians come from India, and so on. We come from here. And when I was in law school, I remember standing around and this one, his name was Norm, he was from Toronto, and he was like, oh my God, Joan, don't talk like that. We won't support you. We won't support you. And I was like, what? You know, support from me is conditional on your approval? No, I don't think so. And so what we were debating was that he was saying that, well, anyways, we came over the Bering Straits, which is still what Frontier School Division probably teaches in all of those communities in Manitoba. I hope they don't. Boy, I hate that. That's not our creation story. Indigenous peoples all have their own creation stories. And so I've had the blessing of being quick-witted, and I said to him, well, Norm, let's say this. Do we agree that it's first in time, first in line? Because the white law, by the way, is a fundamental principle. First in time, first in line. And he's like, yeah. I said, okay, well, if what you're saying is true, we beat you by about 30,000 years, so back the hell up. And he was like, oh, whatever. You know, so we are defined by our land. And I'm not going to talk about that much tonight, but I've had the great privilege of living in Tlingit territory for 28 years now, off and on, in and out. And this land is so powerful and so beautiful, and so is Lake Winnipeg. Like I have a place in our reserve there too, and you know, when I can feel the lake. We belong to the lake, and yeah, we have a relationship with our land because this is where we're from. And you know, like I said, if we came over the Bering Straits, which is practically impossible, well, we beat everybody here anyway. So I wanted to talk about. We're going way too long tonight. I'm sorry. Well, maybe I'll save married and in belonging for tomorrow.